What Michael thought was just another rainy night in Chicago turned his life upside down. An unexpected act of kindness unearthed secrets buried for 2 decades, shedding light on a past he never imagined questioning. Who was Claire, the young mother who crossed his path, and why did she know so much about Rachel, his lost fiancée? The truth would shake everything he believed to be his story. Michael Taylor was a man whose life seemed straight out of a successful movie. He owned a luxurious penthouse in Chicago, exuding power and sophistication. Every detail was meticulously arranged to reflect the successful lawyer he was. But every night, as he crossed the threshold of his home, the deafening silence revealed a void that no amount of wealth could fill. He was a paradox, a man who had everything and, at the same time, felt he had nothing. Michael's days were an endless repetition. Meetings, court hearings, and contracts filled his schedule but not his heart. He lived surrounded by applause and professional recognition, yet no one seemed to see the profound loneliness hidden behind his impeccable suits. Even his few close friends noticed that, beneath the glasses of expensive wine, there was something about him that seemed perpetually stuck in the past. It was almost impossible to think of Michael without remembering Rachel. 20 years ago, she had been the center of his life, his greatest promise of happiness. A brutal accident had taken Rachel from him, along with any genuine attempt to live beyond the memories. He buried himself in work, as if each case he won could somehow fill the void she left behind. But deep down, he knew he was just running away. In the solitude of his nights, Michael often found himself looking at an old photo album hidden in the bottom drawer of his office. It was there that Rachel still seemed alive, her spontaneous smiles frozen in time. There was one particular photo he couldn't bear to look at for long, Rachel holding a blue diary she never let anyone read. He always wondered what she had written so intently inside. Rachel's grave was the only place where Michael allowed his emotions to surface. Every year, on the anniversary of the accident, he brought white flowers and spent long minutes in silence. It was his ritual of mourning, but also of self-punishment. He never said it out loud, but part of him felt responsible, as if he could have done something to prevent that tragic outcome. The weight of guilt followed him like a shadow. Despite all the luxury that surrounded him, there was something profoundly human in the way Michael avoided mirrors. Facing his own reflection was a constant reminder that time was passing, but his pain remained frozen. He had become a master at hiding his wounds, but they were still there, open and throbbing, ready to bleed at the slightest touch. It was the cost of living in the past. To the few who knew him well, Michael was an enigma. Some said he was cold and calculating, but that was just a facade. Behind his rigid demeanor was a man longing for renewal, even if he didn't know how to achieve it. He wanted to believe his life could change, but he was stuck in the belief that the time for second chances had already passed. And so, day after day, he followed the same path to work, walking through Chicago's bustling streets. At times, he felt a pang of envy watching families walking together or couples laughing in cafes. He wondered what it would be like to have that again. The simplicity, the human warmth. But he quickly pushed the thought aside, retreating to the refuge of his routine. Until, on a rainy night, something different happened. Michael was leaving a cafe when he saw, under an awning, a young woman and a little girl who seemed no older than 4. They were soaked, clinging to each other as if the world was too cold to bear. He hesitated for a moment, but something about the scene made him stop. And it was there that the first spark of change ignited. It was a cold, damp night in Chicago, the kind where the rain seems to mix with the wind, whipping against anyone brave enough to walk the streets. Michael, leaving the cafe with his trusty black umbrella, only wanted to get to the warmth of his penthouse. But something caught his attention. A young woman, poorly dressed for the weather, huddled under an awning, holding a wide-eyed blonde little girl close. Both seemed oblivious to the world around them, immersed in their own struggle to stay dry. Michael hesitated. He wasn't the kind of person who got involved, especially with strangers, but something about the scene unsettled him. Maybe it was Claire's eyes, full of a mix of courage and desperation, or the way the little girl, Becca, looked at him as if hoping for something she didn't dare ask. Before he could think it through, he approached, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a wad of cash. "Here, use this to find shelter," he said, trying to sound casual. And, to his own surprise, he took off his coat and handed it to the woman, even though the cold was already biting at him. Claire looked at him with genuine surprise. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling as much as her hands. Michael didn't have a clear answer. "Just take it," he replied, perhaps with more firmness than he intended. The little girl took the coat with a shy smile, and Michael found himself trying to remember the last time a child had smiled at him like that. There was something disarming in its simplicity. As he turned and walked home, Michael felt strange. It wasn't regret, but a discomfort, as if that interaction had planted something in his mind, something he couldn't quite identify. He wasn't used to stopping for anyone, yet this woman and child had affected him in a way he didn't yet understand. "Must be the exhaustion," he muttered to himself, trying to shake the feeling off. Later, back in the warmth of his penthouse, Michael couldn't get Claire and Becca out of his head. Who were they? Why were they alone and vulnerable on such a harsh night? He found himself thinking of little Becca and the brief smile she gave him, a smile that seemed to carry more story than he could imagine. It was as if that little girl had seen more than she should have for her age. For days, Michael tried to ignore how he felt. He buried himself in work, as he always did when something threatened to disturb his fragile routine. But the memories of that night kept returning, especially Claire's eyes. There was something in her gaze, heavy with secrets, that made him want to know more, even if he didn't understand why. A week later, as Michael walked toward his annual visit to Rachel's grave, Claire's image still lingered in his thoughts. He had no idea that fate was about to reconnect them in a way that would challenge everything he believed about his own past. When he finally arrived at the cemetery, Michael saw something that made him freeze mid-step. Claire was there, standing before Rachel's grave, holding flowers in her hands. He stood paralyzed, trying to make sense of what this woman was doing at the most sacred place in his memory. The shock was immediate, but what followed would change his life irreversibly. Michael couldn't yet realize that the rainy night was just the beginning of a journey that would force him to confront painful truths and rediscover who he truly was. Claire was kneeling before Rachel's grave, her face tilted down as if in an intimate moment of prayer. Michael's mind raced for explanations, but none made sense. Slowly, he approached, his heart pounding heavily in his chest. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice more accusatory than curious. Claire looked up, surprised to see him there, but her gaze also carried a knowing look, as if she had anticipated this meeting all along. "She was my mother," Claire said, her voice firm and disarming. Michael took a step back as though her words were a physical blow. "That's impossible," he replied, his tone laced with disbelief and irritation. The idea seemed absurd, like some cruel twist of fate. Rachel had never mentioned a child. How could she have? He thought he knew every detail about the woman, or at least he had believed so until now. Claire sighed, clutching the bouquet of flowers tightly. "I know it sounds strange," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "but I only found out recently myself." Michael narrowed his eyes, trying to determine if this was some sort of ploy. After all, he was a wealthy man, and stories like this weren't uncommon. But there was something about Claire, something genuine he couldn't ignore. Still, his instinct was to resist. "You're telling me Rachel hid this from me? From everyone?" His voice carried more defensiveness than he intended. Memories of Rachel bubbled to the surface, and he felt betrayed just considering the possibility. Claire nodded but didn't look away. "I don't know why she never told you. All I know is here," she said, lifting a trembling hand to offer him a small blue notebook. Michael recognized it instantly, Rachel's diary. Michael stared at the diary but didn't reach for it. Touching it felt like confirming Claire's story, and he wasn't ready for that. "I can't do this right now," he said, his voice quieter, almost a whisper. He turned to leave, leaving Claire standing there, holding the diary like a fragment of the past Michael still refused to confront. Back home, Michael felt like a stranger to himself. Claire's words echoed in his mind, intertwined with memories of Rachel that now seemed different, filled with gaps he had never noticed before. He tried to rationalize it. It was impossible that Rachel had hidden something so monumental. But deep down, a relentless doubt began to creep in. The following days were consumed by denial. Michael buried himself in work, avoided anything that reminded him of Rachel, and tried, unsuccessfully, to erase the encounter with Claire from his memory. He told himself it was a misunderstanding, an elaborate lie. But a part of him knew Claire didn't seem like a manipulator. And that made it all the more disturbing. In the silence of his penthouse, Michael stared into the void. He knew he couldn't ignore this forever. Rachel's diary, that intimate piece of who she was, sat there, waiting for him. But the fear of discovering that his memory of Rachel was a lie paralyzed him. He wasn't ready for revelations, for confronting secrets that could change everything. Meanwhile, the image of Claire and Becca at the cemetery remained vivid in his mind. He knew he had to do something, but he still couldn't take the next step. Not yet. Something told him that diary held answers he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. Michael was determined to avoid Rachel's diary. He left it on the coffee table in his living room, but every time he passed by, he averted his gaze as if the small blue notebook were a trap ready to explode. That was when Sarah, Rachel's best friend and someone Michael regarded as a sister, showed up at his house unannounced. She carried a determined look and in her hands, a cardboard box filled with Rachel's old belongings. "You need to know the truth," was all she said before setting the box down. Sarah knew Michael too well to believe he would open the diary on his own. With a heavy sigh, she sat beside him on the couch and began to speak calmly but firmly. Rachel kept secrets because she thought she was protecting everyone. You, Claire, even herself. But secrets have a way of weighing down the soul, Michael. He listened in silence, feeling her words break through the carefully constructed walls around his emotions. Finally, Sarah opened the diary and began to read aloud. The first pages were light, filled with Rachel's day-to-day details, but then came the confessions. Rachel had discovered her pregnancy weeks before the accident. She was scared, not for herself, but for Michael. "You were always so dedicated to your career, and she didn't want anything to pull you away from what she believed was your destiny," Sarah explained, her voice thick with emotion. She thought she was doing the right thing. The words in the diary hit Michael like punches to the stomach. He was confronted with a Rachel he had never known, a woman full of fears, doubts, and difficult choices. He realized he had idealized Rachel for all these years, turning her into an unattainable symbol of perfection. Now, reality was shattering that image into pieces. And, strangely, he began to feel a deeper connection to her. Michael took the diary from Sarah's hands, unable to wait any longer. He read about Rachel's fear of losing him, about how she thought his career mattered more than anything else. But he also read about the deep love she felt for him, even in moments of doubt. Every word seemed to echo a truth he had tried to ignore. Rachel was as human as he was, with flaws, difficult choices, and regrets. As he read, tears that Michael hadn't shed in years began to fall. He wasn't a man who cried easily, but those words broke him down. He felt guilt for not noticing the weight Rachel had carried alone. But he also felt something unexpected, a strange sense of relief. For the first time, he saw Rachel as she truly was, not as he had constructed her in his mind. When he finished reading, Michael looked at Sarah, who sat in silence, respecting the moment. "I don't know what to do with this," he admitted, his voice hoarse. Sarah placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You start by accepting it. Then you let it guide you." It was simple advice, but full of wisdom. Michael knew he couldn't ignore Claire and Becca anymore. The diary had opened a door he could no longer close. In the days that followed, Michael read the diary repeatedly, absorbing every detail, every emotion. He still didn't know what to do with it all, but something inside him had shifted. He felt he was at the beginning of a journey to understand not only Rachel but himself. And though still hesitant, he knew the next step would take him back to Claire. Claire accepted Michael's invitation to his house, though she was clearly cautious. When she arrived with Becca, Michael felt a mixture of nervousness and hope. He had prepared a simple dinner, something he rarely did, but he wanted to create a welcoming atmosphere. Becca, with her childlike curiosity, quickly broke the ice when she became captivated by the flower arrangements in the living room. Claire, on the other hand, remained guarded, as if bracing herself for whatever might come next. During dinner, Michael began to talk about Rachel, about their relationship and how her death had devastated him. He didn't know exactly where to start, but Claire listened intently. "I never knew she was pregnant," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "If I had known, I would have done everything differently." Claire, her eyes fixed on her plate, responded, "She thought she was protecting you. I don't know if it was the right choice, but it was hers." Her honesty touched him deeply. Becca brought a moment of lightness when she asked to draw something on the coffee table. Michael knelt down to help her find paper and crayons, and for a moment, the weight of the conversation seemed to lift. He realized there was something incredibly healing about watching the simplicity of a child at play. Becca, in her innocence, seemed to see through the barriers adults built around themselves. As Becca drew, Claire finally began to open up. She told Michael how she had learned about Rachel and how her childhood was full of unanswered questions. "When my grandmother gave me the diary, everything started to make sense," she said. "But at the same time, it brought so many new questions." Michael saw himself reflected in her search for meaning, in the confusion of trying to fit together pieces that didn't seem to align. Michael knew he had crossed an important threshold. He had spent years isolated in his pain, but now he stood at the edge of a chance for reconnection. Claire and Becca represented something new, something frightening but also incredibly necessary. He realized that, while the past was full of secrets and twists, the present offered him an opportunity for renewal. As the evening went on, the atmosphere grew lighter. Claire and Michael began sharing stories about Rachel, moments that made them laugh and, in some cases, cry. It was as though they were reconstructing a fuller picture of who she had been, piecing together fragments each of them had held onto in isolation. Becca, despite her young age, seemed to sense the depth of the moment, occasionally interrupting with questions that drew genuine smiles. At the end of the evening, Claire thanked Michael for having them over. "I think my mom would be happy that we're here," she said with a shy smile. Michael simply nodded, knowing that words couldn't fully express what that moment meant to him. As he watched them leave, something inside him knew that this was only the beginning of something much larger. In the days that followed, Michael began to reevaluate his life. He knew he would have to face more revelations and challenges, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. He was willing to face whatever came next because, now, there was something, or rather, someone, that made it all worth it. Michael knew he was only beginning to understand what Claire and Becca represented in his life. But the path to connection wouldn't be easy. At every step, he confronted his own doubts and fears. Over the following weeks, he dedicated himself to spending more time with Claire, listening to stories about her childhood, and finding subtle ways to bond with Becca, like teaching her how to build puzzles or play chess. Still, one question gnawed at him. Why had Rachel kept this secret from him? Reading the diary continued to be an emotional roller coaster. Michael uncovered more details about Rachel's pregnancy, but also about the struggles she faced while deciding whether to tell him the truth. The diary was both a comfort and a source of pain. Each new page brought a revelation that forced Michael to confront not just Rachel's choices but his own inability to see what had been happening around him. Claire, meanwhile, was becoming an unexpected ally. Despite her initial hesitation, she began to trust Michael, allowing him to grow closer to Becca and be part of small but meaningful moments in their lives. One afternoon, they went to the park, and Michael watched as Becca played with other children. It was such a simple scene, but it carried immense significance for him. For the first time in years, he found joy in the small, ordinary moments. But Michael had internal enemies he needed to face. His guilt over what had happened with Rachel continued to haunt him, as did his fear of allowing himself to be vulnerable again. He wondered whether he deserved a second chance, whether he could be the father Claire needed or the grandfather Becca deserved. These thoughts often kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling as he questioned every decision he had ever made. Claire also brought up another secret that shook him. Rachel had been in a brief relationship with another man, Thomas, before meeting Michael. The possibility that Thomas might be Claire's father left Michael torn. He wanted to believe Rachel loved him enough not to hide something so significant, but doubt was inevitable. This revelation made Michael question the idealized version of Rachel he had held on to and forced him to confront the more complex aspects of their relationship. Thomas wasn't just a shadow of the past, he was a living figure who carried his own truths. Michael decided to meet him, despite his reservations. The meeting was tense and emotionally charged. Thomas revealed that, for years, he believed he was Claire's father but had recently discovered that Rachel had always known the truth and chose not to tell anyone. The revelation left Michael even more torn between anger and understanding. As Michael grappled with these uncomfortable truths, he found strength in Becca. Her innocence was a constant reminder that the past, no matter how complicated, didn't have to define the present. He began dedicating more time to her, teaching her how to care for a small garden on his penthouse terrace and reading her bedtime stories. These moments brought a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. Still, the greatest test was yet to come. Michael knew he needed to find a way to forgive Rachel for her choices and himself for his shortcomings. He didn't know how, but something within him was changing. He began to understand that pain and secrets didn't have to mark the end of his story. Instead, they could be the beginning of something new. Despite all his progress, the questions continued to echo in his mind. How could he rebuild his memory of Rachel while creating something new with Claire and Becca? Michael felt he was on the brink of something transformative, but the path ahead remained as uncertain as ever. One of the most unexpected rewards was the role Becca played in Michael's healing process. She didn't see the emotional scars he carried, nor did she care about his past mistakes. To her, he was simply Grandpa Michael, someone who made her laugh and taught her things like planting seeds or solving riddles. Each interaction with her was a reminder that genuine love doesn't demand perfection, only presence. Claire, in turn, began to make more room for Michael in her life. She invited him to Becca's school events, simple dinners at her home, and even conversations about the challenges she faced as a single mother. Michael started to realize that, although he still felt guilty for not being there from the beginning, he now had the chance to be part of their present and future. It was a gift he never thought he would receive. In a particularly symbolic moment, Michael decided to renovate the old family cabin for Claire and Becca. It was a project he had been putting off for years, but now it seemed like the right gesture to build something new. He invited Claire to help plan the renovations, and she eagerly agreed. Becca, of course, wanted to help too, painting pictures on the temporary walls that Michael promised to preserve as a memory of that time. Rachel's diary was still there, but Michael felt his relationship with it had changed. He no longer saw it as a source of pain but as a guide that helped him understand not just Rachel but also himself. He stored the diary in a special place, knowing he would return to it but no longer feeling the urgency to find all the answers at once. He had learned that some truths must be uncovered gradually. Michael knew his journey was far from over, but he felt more complete. In Claire and Becca, he had found not only a connection to Rachel but also a new kind of love he never imagined was possible. Watching Becca run through the garden one afternoon, he realized something. The past might be full of secrets and twists, but the present is where life truly happens. With the family cabin under renovation, Michael began spending more weekends with Claire and Becca, immersing himself in the simplicity of life in the countryside. He decided to transform the place into more than just a house. It would be a refuge for his new family. Every nail hammered and every wall painted seemed to symbolize a part of his soul being rebuilt. Manual labor, something he had never valued, now felt therapeutic. Becca loved helping, though her idea of renovations involved more glitter and stickers than actual tools. One starry night, Claire and Michael sat on the cabin's makeshift porch. The comfortable silence was broken by Claire as she confessed something she had been holding back. For a long time, I felt like I had no roots. Like I was always drifting, searching for something I could never name. Michael looked at her, feeling a pang in his heart. And now, he asked. Claire smiled faintly. I think I'm starting to find my place. Becca, on the other hand, was loving every moment. She nicknamed the cabin the House of Secrets, insisting that every corner hid something magical. To Michael, it felt fitting. The cabin, in a way, symbolized everything he was discovering about himself, about Rachel, and about the new life he was building. When Becca found an old drawer filled with black and white photos, she squealed with joy. Look, real secrets. Michael and Claire laughed, but Michael felt the symbolic weight of that moment. As time passed, Michael realized the changes were not only in his relationship with Claire and Becca but also within himself. He returned to attending the opera, something Rachel had loved, and brought Claire and Becca along on one occasion. During the performance, as Becca dozed off on Claire's lap, he felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. It was as though the music filled the spaces once occupied by loneliness and regret. Evenings in Chicago began to feel different as well. Michael, who had once avoided the company of others, started hosting small dinners at his home. Claire and Becca were always the center of attention, and he loved watching them interact with his few close friends. Their presence in his life made him see the world in a lighter, more vibrant way. He began to realize that happiness didn't have to be monumental. It could be found in simple conversations, spontaneous laughter, and shared glances. The biggest challenge, however, was fully accepting who he had become. Michael knew he still carried remnants of his old definition of success, an obsession with control and the need to appear infallible. But watching Becca play with a broken toy car, insisting it was still the fastest in the world, he began to understand that imperfections didn't diminish value. If anything, they made things more authentic. One day, while cleaning out the basement of his Chicago penthouse, Michael found a box he thought had been lost. Inside was the dress Rachel had worn the day they met. He brought the dress to the cabin and showed it to Claire, who was moved to see a tangible piece of her mother's story. She loved this dress, Michael said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Maybe Becca will want to wear it one day. Claire smiled, wiping away a tear. Maybe. At the end of a quiet afternoon at the cabin, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael watched Becca play with an improvised kite while Claire organized books on a newly installed shelf. He realized that finding his way back wasn't about returning to what was lost but about discovering something new in the present. He didn't need to understand every decision Rachel had made or justify every choice he himself had made. What mattered was that, in that moment, he was exactly where he needed to be. Rachel's grave had never looked so different to Michael as it did on that sunny autumn morning. For years, his visits had been marked by silence and melancholy, but this time, he brought flowers with a lighter purpose. As he placed the arrangement of white lilies, he didn't feel the crushing weight of guilt. Instead, there was a newfound serenity. "I finally understand," he murmured, as if speaking directly to Rachel. "Love is more complicated than I thought. But I think I can accept that now." Claire and Becca arrived shortly after, carrying a small bouquet of daisies that Becca had chosen herself. Without hesitation, the little girl placed the flowers next to Michael's. "Mommy always said colorful flowers make people happy," she said with a smile, and Michael couldn't help but feel the profound impact of such a simple statement. Rachel was still present, even in the smallest of Becca's actions, and that comforted him in a way he never imagined. That family moment at Rachel's grave marked the closure of a chapter for Michael. He realized he was ready to let go of the weight of the past. It didn't mean forgetting or diminishing what had happened, but accepting that he couldn't change it. He was rebuilding his life with Claire and Becca, and that was enough. For the first time, he felt genuine peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. In the days that followed, Michael began doing something he had avoided for a long time, looking toward the future. He invested in fully restoring the cabin, transforming it into a warm and welcoming space for Claire and Becca. He planned to spend weekends there with them, surrounded by nature and away from the distractions of the city. While painting the last wall, he realized how much the house reflected his journey, imperfect but full of potential for beauty. Additionally, he began supporting Claire in more practical ways. Using his legal expertise, he guided her in starting a small graphic design business, something she had always wanted but never had the confidence to pursue. Watching Claire grow and find her independence brought Michael a satisfaction he hadn't felt since the early days of his career. He realized that by helping her, he was also rediscovering his own sense of purpose. Becca, as always, was the heart of the house. Her energy and curiosity filled Michael's days in ways he never expected. One evening, while they were building pillow forts in the living room, Becca stopped and looked at him with the seriousness only children can muster. "Do you think Mommy is proud of us?" she asked. Michael didn't hesitate before replying, "I'm sure she is." And in that moment, he realized he truly believed it. As Michael adjusted to the new dynamics in his life, he began making room for aspects he had long neglected. He reconnected with old friends, sharing parts of his journey with Claire and Becca. Each conversation felt like a reaffirmation of his transformation, solidifying the person he was becoming. He realized that the solitude that once defined him had become nothing more than a distant memory. One quiet afternoon at the cabin, Claire found Michael in the garden planting new flowers. She approached him and, almost without thinking, said, "You know, I don't think I've ever seen you this happy." He smiled, gazing out at the horizon. "Neither have I," he replied, and the two of them fell into a comfortable silence, watching Becca chase butterflies that flitted around her. Michael felt, more than ever, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Michael still visited Rachel's grave from time to time, but the visits no longer carried the same weight. It felt more like visiting an old friend, someone who, despite her flaws and secrets, had shaped his life in ways he was only now beginning to understand. He felt gratitude not just for Rachel but for Claire and Becca, who had brought back a light he thought he had lost forever. Michael finally understood that his true legacy wasn't in the awards on his wall or the milestones of his career. It was in Becca's laughter as she ran through the cabin, in candid conversations with Claire about the future, and in the peace he now felt when reflecting on the past. He had become more than a respected lawyer. He was a devoted grandfather, a father still learning, and, most importantly, a man willing to live fully. The cabin, once a symbol of abandonment, was now the beating heart of their family. Michael had renovated every corner with Claire and Becca's help, and each detail told a story. In the kitchen, a chalkboard where Becca drew daily. In the living room, a bookshelf filled with books Michael and Claire had chosen together. In the garden, flowers Becca swore she talked to every day. It was a place where the past, present, and future coexisted. One evening, during an outdoor dinner, Michael reflected on how much he had changed. Claire laughed at a poorly told joke, and Becca begged him to sing a song they had learned together. He looked at them and felt a gratitude so deep that it was hard to contain. The man who, years ago, lived surrounded by silence and loneliness was now immersed in love and joy. "Thank you," he said suddenly, catching Claire off guard. "For what?" she asked, confused. Michael simply smiled. "For everything." Back in Chicago, Michael continued balancing his professional and personal life. He started taking on pro bono cases, something he had never considered before. Helping people who needed legal guidance but couldn't afford it gave him a sense of finally giving back to the world. It was an extension of the purpose he found alongside Claire and Becca, a way to multiply the impact of the transformation he had experienced. Becca became his greatest teacher in the ongoing lessons of life. Every time she pulled him into a game or made him laugh with her observations, he felt like he was reclaiming a piece of the childhood he had missed with Claire. He couldn't change the past, but he was determined to be part of the future. "You know you're my hero, right, Grandpa?" Becca said one day as he pushed her on a swing. Michael smiled, his eyes misty. "And you're mine, sweetheart." Claire also flourished in her new life. With Michael's support, her business began to grow, and she found an independence she had always dreamed of but never had the courage to pursue. Michael watched with pride as she took charge of her life, knowing he had helped create the space for her to thrive. Seeing Claire so fulfilled was the confirmation he needed that embracing the truth, no matter how painful, had been the right choice. Over time, Michael began recording his memories in a journal, a sort of diary where he reflected on the lessons he had learned. He wrote about Rachel, about the secrets that had bound them and driven them apart, about Claire and Becca, and about the love he had rediscovered. It wasn't a journal of regrets, but of gratitude. He knew his story, though full of twists and turns, was ultimately one of redemption. On the last page of the journal, Michael wrote something that encapsulated his journey. "Life isn't about perfect endings, but about moments we choose to turn into new beginnings. Today, I choose to live, to love, and to become more than I ever thought I could be." And with that, he closed the journal with a smile, ready to face whatever the next chapter might bring.